Preface for this episode. The following material is not suitable for kids. Viewers' discretion is advised. Vampires, demons of the night, creatures who live in eternal darkness. Who haven't heard of them? They seem to be prevalent in our mainstream culture, colonizing as diverse genres as movies, books, and going even further to animation, games, and mangas. Despite the seemingly abundant depictions of vampires, their newest cultural rendition is a far cry from the folk tales of old. Today, I would like to invite you to follow me on a quest to find a true vampire, a creature far more horrific than modern-day cinema would like to present to us. Welcome, Internet Traveler, to the first episode of Blue Moon podcast, in which we shall answer the age-old questions of how to recognize a vampire and how to safeguard oneself from it, and, if it's already too late, how to deal with a vampire. There are such beings as vampires. Some of us have evidence that they exist. Even had we not the proof of our own unhappy experience, the teachings and the records of the past give proof enough to sane peoples. I admit that at first I was skeptic, were it not that through long years I have trained myself to keep an open mind. I could not have believed until such time as that fact thundered on my ear. See, I prove. Alas, had I known at the first what now I know, nay, had I even guessed at him, one so precious life had been spared to many of us who did love her, but that is gone, and we must work that other poor souls perish not whilst we can save. The Nosferatu do not die like the bee when he stings once. He is only stronger, and being stronger have yet more power to work evil. This vampire which is amongst us is of himself so strong in person as 20 men. He is of cunning more than mortal, for his cunning be the growth of ages. He hath still the aids of necromancy, which is, as his etymology imply, the divination by the dead, and all the dead that can come nigh to are for him at command. He is brute, and more than brute, he is devil in cowls, and the heart of him is not. He can, within limitations, appear at will, when and where, and in any of the forms that are to him. He can, within his range, direct the elements, the storm, the fog, the thunder. He can command all the meaner things, the rat and the owl and the bat, the moth and the fox and the wolf. He can grow and become small, and he can, at times, vanish and become unknown. How then are we to begin our strike to destroy him? How shall we find his where, and having found it, how can we destroy? My friends, this is much. It is a terrible task that we undertake, and there may be consequence to make the brave shudder, for if we fail in this our fight, he must surely win. And there, weren't we? Life is nothings. I heed him not, but to fail here is not mere life or death. It is that we become as him, that we henceforward become foul things of the night like him, without heart or conscience, preying on the bodies and the souls of those we love best. To us forever are the gates of heaven shut, for who shall open them to us again? We go on for all time abhorred by all, a blot on the face of God's sunshine, and arrow in the side of him who died for men. But we are face to face with duty, and in such case must we shrink? For me, I say no, but then I am old, and life with his sunshine, his fair places, his song of birds, his music and his love, lie far behind. You others are young. Some have seen sorrow, but there are fair days yet in store. What say you? Well, what do you say, Internet Traveler? What you've just heard was a quote from Bram Stoker's Dracula. Those words were said by Professor Van Helsing. But before we move on in our quest to find a true vampire, we need to address first thing. And the first thing is, as with any good research, we should try and understand the origin of a vampire. and it is a complex one, especially because it is deeply connected to blood, which by people of elden times was seen as both a life force and residence of one's soul, as well as something deeply impure, a mixture of life and death. Jean-Paul Roux, in his book, summarizes the status of blood this way: closely associated with images of death, yet even more so with images of life, which ultimately always triumphs. Blood was simultaneously regarded as dangerous and healing, bringing misfortune and bringing happiness, impure and pure. If it still repels and attracts, it is because everything sacred possesses a nature that is unclear and ambiguous. Sort of by extension, this paradoxical status of blood would wrap onto what was thought and believed of a vampire, giving it its ambivalent nature of a creature that is dead and alive simultaneously. René Prédal is even willing to go a step further and states, by ensuring the nocturnal life through drinking the blood of the living, the vampire is an image of myth that constitutes a pagan version of Christian mythology, offering believers the body and blood of Christ. There is also another difficulty that one inevitably runs into when speaking about vampires and their origins, and that is of how far in time one wants to dig. Are you willing to include Erinyes, Lamia or Empusei of the Greek-Roman mythology and traditions? Or maybe, in your quest, you'd like to go even further back in time and visit the ancient Mesopotamia? I am mentioning it only to signal that an idea of a demon or spirit which sustains itself on human's blood seems to be as ancient as humanity and its fascination with blood itself. However, today we will be concentrating mainly on what is sometimes referred to as a Carpathian or Balkan vampire, or in broader geographical terms, an image of a vampire that was shared by folk people in Central and Eastern Europe in the last couple of centuries. To show how important the subject was to folks a few centuries ago, and indeed how prevalent the vampires were, let me quote Józef Maksymilian Ossoliński, who in his novel Wieczory Badeńskie, which were written at the end of the 18th century, states: nothing was discussed more in the entire vicinity of Trembowla than Upirs. It was said in one village that 2 miles from there, sneaking into the barn at night and untying the cattle from the mangers, the cows and oxen were led in a circle by the tails. In the village where this was supposed to have happened, no one knew about it, but people talked that in the very village from which the news came, a vampire, having arrived at a peasant's house during supper, knocked all the spoons out of everyone's hands and ate everything that was cooked. Somewhere, a hungrier one sucked the blood from all the living under one roof, leaving only one chick in the cradle for propagation. Along crossroads, in guest houses, on paths, by woods, on mountains, in ravines, evil piled up in heaps, travellers met travellers on the road, first asking if they had seen an Upir anywhere. Everyone, without exception, thanked God that their misfortune had passed, reassuring one another that there were as many of those creatures in the area as ants in an anthill. In several parishes, the Russian clergy, in several others, the Latin clergy, ordered the graves to be dug up for the deceased, and cut off their heads in open court, pierced their hearts with stakes. The sweat of the vampire was more expensive to sell than burnt brandy. The powder went at a higher price even than crystalline salt, for it must be known that according to the experiences gathered by Colmet, these 2 remedies for the plague of vampires are more helpful than the vinegar of 4 thieves for the Black Death is. Perhaps because of their popularity, when we want to move on to the discussion of the name, vampire, itself, as with every other aspect so far, this part is also shrouded in mystery, and there seems to be no consensus about the etymology. Heinrich Kunstmann, based on a phonetic analysis, which is considered very reliable, derives the vampire from the Greek hero's name Amphiraos. The Old Slavic Wampir originated from the hero under whom the earth parted and swallowed him alive. At this place, where the hero, alive after death, sank into the ground, an oracle and a temple were created. Another idea for the origin of the word vampire was stated by Alexander Brückner, who wrote, "Our ancient writers derived upiera, upierzycę, accurately from pierze, feathers, although they explained it incorrectly. In upyr, or in Wampir in Bulgarian, pyr is the same as in nietopysz, see nietoperz, but, from the root per, meaning to fly. The original vampire had the form of a nocturnal bird with a long, sharp beak, with which it sucked the blood of its victims. See sayings as read as a vampire." So, how does a person become a vampire? To answer this question, we have to delve into a complex relationship between those who are alive and those who are dead. It would be helpful to discuss death-related rites of passage according to Van Gennep, which can be distinguished by 3 moments. First, the ritual of separation, detachment, exclusion from the temporary state, for example, carrying the body to the cemetery. Second, the ritual of the margin, such as vigil. Third, the ritual of incorporation into the next state, such as a funeral feast. If one of these phases is not completed properly, death can become a bad death, and the deceased can be dangerous to everyone. The dead should not feel resentment or desire for revenge. They are to join the new community, the community of the dead, and not disturb the living. Ludwig Stoma, who in his research of a demon-related beliefs of Polish countryside used Van Gennep's concepts, noticed that the situation of suspension between individual phases of life and the boundary between life and death also divides 2 states of existence, corresponds in folklore to the situation of being stuck neither here nor there, between the society of the dead and the living, so those who died in a state of margin, or whose death was not preceded and confirmed by the appropriate ritual, those who died and did not die, remain beings belonging nowhere, not fitting into either this or that world. They become demons. Jean-Claude Schmitt lists malicious souls, namely victims of violent death who desire revenge, tainted souls, souls wandering near the grave, the unburied, unsepulti, suicides, biotanati, women who died in childbirth. This broad category can be extended even further to include those who died without last rites, excommunicated, unbaptized, children from incestuous unions, a child born as the 7th in a family or born with a cowl, which must be removed from its head by magical means so that it does not become a vampire after death. Those so-called strange deceased are usually buried in border places, thus belonging to both adjacent territories and simultaneously not belonging to any of them. According to folk beliefs, there, in these dangerous places, at the edge of the village or field, at crossroads, by the road, the deceased appear already transformed into demons. It seems that although these people died, but without the special rites they cannot enter the realm of the dead, and so, in a way, they become immortal for a certain period of time. In this view, the death is not a one-time event, but rather something progressive which changes over time. This ambiguity is exactly the space within which vampires exist, as traditionally they were viewed as either ghosts of the dead or the dead themselves brought back to life by either internal or external malevolent power, spirit. They are the living dead, and so they lead an existence that is liminal and as such may last for centuries. So, how do you recognize a vampire? Indeed, that is a question. As we will see in the examples derived from folktales, every and all abnormalities or strangeness in the way a person looks like may be a sure sign of their demonic nature, although depending on the region and time, the same signs may relate to different creatures. Still, when in doubt whether you are dealing with a vampire or not, search for the following signs. Red face or tendency to blush. See sayings by Bulgarians, Serbs and Poles. Read as a vampire. Czerwen kao wampir. Zaczerwienił se kao wampir. Folklore explains this as vampires drinking blood. In Poland, sometimes the lack of eyebrows may characterize a vampire. In Lesser Poland, their symbol is also the lack of hair under the arms and in the crotch. Red or glowing eyes. Among Bulgarians, the lack of a nose. Vampires may have 2 rows of teeth, which they are usually born with. They also have 2 hearts, or 2 souls. There was also a single mention from Lesser Poland about a vampire who had a saw inside him instead of a spine. People born with 6 fingers on hands or feet. People born with a tail. So now that you know how you can recognize a vampire, it's good to understand how does a vampire kill its victim. It usually torments the living beings until their death. It mostly attacks humans, but in some regions people say that cattle or other farm animals may also be victims of the blood-sucking creature. The most common modus operandi for Wapirs would be drinking or sucking of blood from the heart or veins of its victims, devouring their flesh, strangling them to death, less commonly killing by breathing into their mouths. It was also commonly believed that a vampire would primarily attack its own family and relatives. It could also have sexual relations with its still living spouse. The belief that a vampire attacks mostly their own family would be the main cause of flaring up of vampire paranoia in countryside. Every time there were a few sudden deaths, either within the same household or in the same village, in such situations the villagers would dig up either the body of the person who died first, so starting the deathly streak, or who for one or another reason was deemed the most plausible candidate for being a vampire. In such cases there were several options or methods with which folks could solve the vampire problem. According to Moszyński, an ethnographer and author of Slavic folk culture, the Slavic peasants knew many ways to neutralize a deceased person who was suspected of becoming a vampire or who was already known to be a vampire, ranging from the most trivial to the burning of the corpse. They often used a couple or several different methods simultaneously, if possible. The corpse would be taken to a swamp and abandoned there or buried at a crossroads. A pile of stones would be heaped on the grave. The corpse would be turned face down so that it would bite into the ground instead of leaving the grave. Poppy seeds would be thrown into the coffin and a sickle or scythe would be placed inside, sometimes on the neck of the deceased. A pebble or coin would be placed under the tongue. The fingers of both hands would be tied together behind the back. The heels would be cut or the tendons under the knees would be severed, obviously to prevent the deceased from walking. The head would also be cut off and placed at the feet or between the legs. This is undoubtedly the source of the beliefs about vampires carrying their own heads in their hands, etc., etc. However, the most common practice was piercing the body with thorns or sharp stakes. In the south, hawthorn stakes. In the north, usually aspen, maple or linden stakes were also used. Thorns were driven into the flesh under the tongue, presumably to prevent the vampire from consuming flesh and sucking blood. They were also driven under the toenails, into the abdomen, near the navel, etc. The heart was usually pierced with an aspen or other stake, but sometimes, for example, the buttocks. The western Little Russians around Brest and the Bug River, around Brody, would pierce the head with a sharp aspen stake. Elsewhere, this was done with a nail, driving it through the forehead into the depths. According to findings from Piotrków near Wrocław, etc., large nails were also once driven through the skulls from the forehead or crown into the brain by Poles or their neighboring Germans. The Serbo-Croats protected themselves from vampires in the same way until recent times, driving wooden stakes or nails through the skulls of corpses, and the famous H. Obermeier recently described such finds from Spain. In connection with this, one cannot help but wonder if all the ancient skulls recognized by prehistorians as trepanned were correctly identified. In other words, if there aren't among them some that were once pierced by a wooden stake, which naturally rotted away in the ground. End of quotes. So now you know all there is to know about Wapirs, vampires and how to deal with them. I wish you farewell, internet traveler. Postscriptum. If you enjoyed listening to this episode, please leave a like on the video or a comment beneath it, so that I know to prepare more content like this one. For now, I invite you to give a listen to the vampire-related audiobooks already available on the channel.